Xtalks is the industry leader in connecting life science, food, healthcare, and medical device professionals. The Xtalks Life Science Podcast features insightful conversations with industry experts about all things pharma, biotech, and more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Vera Kovacevic, editor-in-chief at xtalks.com, and this week I'd like to introduce a very special guest on the show. We have with us today Rohan Palekar, who is the CEO of 89bio. And Rohan is here with us today to discuss one of the fastest growing and often overlooked public health challenges, which is metabolic dysfunction-associated steatohepatitis, commonly known as MASH. And so this is also known as fatty liver disease. So Rohan, welcome. First of all, welcome to the show. We're very happy to have you here with us today.
Well, thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate the invitation and look forward to our discussions.
Great. So before we kind of dive into MASH and how it's different from other liver diseases, I wanted to ask you more about your career journey and what led you to become the CEO of 89bio and what 89bio, how it tries to be an innovator in the MASH space.
Sure. So I have been in biotech and pharma my entire career, so 30 plus years across a big range of companies. I had a long career with Johnson & Johnson, and then I've been at smaller companies, including companies in oncology and CNS like Medivation, Avenir Pharmaceuticals, and have been at 89bio since our inception. I was the first US employee at 89bio when we set up the company in 2018. And what really brought me to 89bio was the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of patients with liver and cardiometabolic diseases. As you mentioned, MASH is a disease with a significant unmet need, and there were no therapeutic options. And what got me excited when I was approached to take on this role was the opportunity to make an impact in an area where, with the growing prevalence of obesity and diabetes, it's going to become arguably a pretty significant issue. And mechanistically, I was pretty excited about the technology which 89bio had, and that's why I kind of came here. And I have had kind of a career spanning everything from doing commercial to doing business development to running scientific teams. And to come in and try and build a company was very exciting because you could put all the pieces together.
Great. And yes, you mentioned that MASH is really the numbers for people that are being affected by MASH is growing up. And I think it's projected to reach around 27 million cases in the US by 2030. And you've kind of compared it along the likes of, obesity or cardiovascular diseases. So could you share or talk more about what's driving this sharp rise in MASH?
Yeah, so if I take a step back, right, so MASH is a chronic progressive condition. It's a severe form of what you call fatty liver disease, where it kind of initiates with patients having deposition of fat in their liver. And in some people, they might stay there. But in some patients, what happens is as the fat accumulates, the liver can't process it. It ultimately gets inflamed, and over time, it becomes fibrotic. And that's what's called MASH. And that is the problematic state of MASH. But the one thing which is important is all these patients have an underlying metabolic dysregulation. So there's something wrong with their metabolic systems, okay? And that's at its core. So you have a very large percentage of these patients have type 2 diabetes or obesity. Those are the two most prominent metabolic dysregulations associated with MASH. So some of the other classic metabolic dysregulations is dyslipidemias, cholesterol elevations, hypertension. Those are found in MASH patients, but not necessarily in every MASH patient. So what's driving the very significant growth is the increase in rates of diabetes and obesity. That's one of the biggest drivers of the projections moving forward. And if you look at the past 10 years, whether in the United States or globally, there's been a very rapid increase in obesity rates as well as diabetes rates. Part of it is diet, part of it is lifestyle. So, despite the fact that there have been improved therapeutic options for those diseases, they continue to grow. And so that's driving a lot of the increase in prevalence. Now, the other thing I think is the advancement of diagnostics and procedures and screening for MASH. Currently, not many people screen for MASH, and that's why in some ways it's a little bit of a silent disease because it's not something you feel, I could be sitting with a fatty liver. I am not feeling anything. It's not changing my function. It's not changing, and now you're starting to have improved diagnostics, whether it's ultrasounds, whether it's blood tests. And so part of this is increased education in the field. Part of it is physicians starting to diagnose patients. And that we believe is going to increase. It doesn't fundamentally change the core of prevalence, but it changes the way patients get diagnosed and then hopefully one day treated.
And so let's say, how would a patient, what are some of the typical symptoms that a patient would be having if they have MASH? Or what would cause one to seek the diagnosis? Because you're saying, is it mostly like non-symptomatic, or what would cause someone to go out there, talk to a doctor, and then how would they be screened for MASH? And what are the gold standard tests to diagnose MASH?
Sure. So you hit on one of the key challenges with this disease. Most of the patients with MASH, at least in the earlier stages, have few, if not no symptoms. And the symptoms become more significant in the later stages of the disease. And that's why very often these patients remain undetected for years, arguably for decades, right? And just to frame it, right? So there's early stage MASH, which I will call it's just fatty liver. You have then fibrosis stages all the way from 0, 1, 2, 3, and then 4 is cirrhotic, right? So some patients in the advanced stage will feel fatigue. Some could have what's called upper quadrant pain. They're feeling something, and they might present themselves. But more often than not, the more common way people get screened and diagnosed is I'm in my physician office. I'm doing a routine blood test. Okay. And now I see elevated liver enzymes. And the physician goes, okay, you're obese, you're diabetic, you have elevated liver enzymes. Maybe we want to do the next test. Okay. That's predominantly what happens. The definitive diagnosis for MASH is actually a biopsy. But biopsies are incredibly invasive procedures. So unless you're really advanced, it's very unlikely that someone is going to go in for a biopsy. Also, unless you're in a gastroenterologist or hepatology office, it's unlikely you're going to get biopsied, right? But as you can imagine, when I talk about things like obesity, metabolic dysregulation, diabetes, they are predominantly in primary care or endocrinology offices, right? So that's the one thing. Now, the other thing which is very important to note is when we've talked to physicians, until a recent drug was approved, which was the first drug approved last year, there was no impetus for them to screen for the disease. Because at its core, someone walks into my office, I have obesity, I have diabetes. I'm going to tell them, manage your diet, manage your lifestyle. I might put you on a diabetes therapy. That would be the same even if I diagnosed them for MASH, right? With no therapeutic options, I'm going to tell them manage your diet, exercise, lifestyle modifications, right? So when you think about the diagnosis, that's how it is today. Now, what is encouraging is they're developing new blood-based tests. They're developing a lot of like ultrasound tests. which can be done by a broad swath of physicians, and they're getting adopted, right? You can be doing an ultrasound in a physician office. They look if your liver has stiffness, and you can diagnose MASH. So I think that's very encouraging for the field because a lot of these patients are going to present and they could get diagnosed. The other thing which is also very encouraging is some of the societies are putting out treatment guidelines to do this. So, for example, the American Diabetes Association last year updated their treatment guidelines that if a patient has diabetes and meets a certain threshold for obesity or body mass index, BMI, they should be screened for MASH. And while it's not yet got broadly adopted, I'm encouraged when we talk to these physicians, they're starting to do that. And then similarly, the GI groups and the hepatology groups have also started adopting new treatment guidelines, which have just been published. So I do think it's going to be a combination of increased awareness with patients as well as in the physician community, which could help identify and diagnose a lot more patients.
And so, that kind of brings me to my next question, Rohan, because I wanted to gain a better understanding. Currently, when patients are being screened for MASH, are they being diagnosed? Are most patients being diagnosed with a later stage of the disease? Do you think these guidelines will help catch people that are kind of more in the earlier stage of the disease?
So that's a very good question. I do think it's going to catch patients across the entire spectrum of the disease. And the reason I say that is a very significant part of the patient population is the earlier stages of the disease. If I look at advanced fibrosis, which I would classify as like, say, F2, F3 disease and F4 disease, that's less than 50% of the disease. Cirrhosis is probably less than 10%, right? Those patients have a very profound changes, say, on liver enzymes. That's very easy. You see that, and then you can do what's called fibroscan, where you're doing ultrasound of the liver, you're doing a blood test, and you say, okay, that's very clear. But the earlier stages, you can do an ultrasound and you will get a sense of how much liver fat is there. They might not have the other things that the liver has got scarred and fibrotic, right? And for some of those patients, the treatment alternative might be just diet and lifestyle. But at least now you know they have that. And then you would do active monitoring every 2 years or every year to continue to see if those patients have progressed. So I do think you will catch a lot of patients. Clearly, the unmet need and the opportunity for intervention is those patients who are further progressed.
So you would say that the biggest unmet needs in MASH today are the patients that are further progressed with the disease.
Yes. So I would say absolutely. It's the patients who have advanced fibrosis are at the greatest risk. And this is the reason why. If your fibrosis continues to progress, unfortunately, at one point, it is going to result in bad outcomes. So the patients with the highest unmet need today are those who've already got cirrhosis. The medical burden and the downstream consequences of not doing anything for a patient who has cirrhosis are pretty dire, right? These are the patients who have bad outcomes, meaning today it is a leading cause of liver transplant. Some of these patients will end up with hepatic carcinomas, right? And a lot of these patients will succumb to cardiovascular mortality. So you do want to try and make sure you can do something to prevent their progression of fibrosis and ideally reverse their fibrosis. There's a second group, I think, who is important to think about from an unmet need, and these are patients who have MASH, but also have increased cardiovascular risk because of their cardiovascular morbidities. So as I mentioned, cardiovascular events is a primary cause of morbidity mortality in this patient group. So think about it. Someone has high liver fat, has fibrosis, but also has really bad triglycerides, really bad LDL. It compounds itself. So those are some of the groups who are likely the highest unmet need and the ones you really want to treat as quickly as possible.
I see. And so you would say that for the later stage patients, right? Like one of the critical goals of treatment would be to reverse liver fibrosis if possible?
Yes. I I would classify it as prevent the progression of fibrosis. So, right. So in the earlier stages of MASH, the treatment objective is resolve the steatohepatitis or resolve the fat in the liver. Okay. Because some patients, you resolve that, they could stay in that state for 5 and 10 years. They'll never progress. Once you're later stage, your primary treatment objective is prevent progression of fibrosis because you want to prevent them from ever becoming cirrhotic. Now, reversal of fibrosis is the gold standard because if you bring someone from F3 back to F2, it's going to be many years till they ever become F4, right? And so the objective is if you can do that, you will make an impact. And there is great scientific data which shows the long-term outcome of patients with F2 disease is better than F3 disease, is better than F4 disease. And it's pretty dramatic when you look at what's called the Kaplan-Meier curves. It's pretty dramatic.
Oh, could you share more about that?
So what they did is there's a publication which looked at if a patient had F2 disease versus F3 disease versus F4 disease, and over a longitudinal time period, what are liver events and what is outcomes, including things like transplant, death, etc. And the delta is like multiple fold. So if you were F2 disease, just for example, if the number is 2, the risk factor by F3 goes to 5, the risk factor by F4 goes to like 12. So so if you are able to bring someone from a cirrhosis condition back to F3, you're going to reduce the likelihood that they will have a bad outcome very, very significantly. And that's why fibrosis is the most important thing for these patients, or reversal of fibrosis is the most important thing for these patients.
I see. And so now I was hoping to talk more about clinical research in the MASH space. As we know, of course, that's the way that all drugs and therapies and diagnostics get approved. And so what are some of the challenges in running clinical trials for MASH today? Is one of them not just recruiting patients, but perhaps a liver biopsy would be needed in order to make them eligible for the trial? Or could you share more about some of the biggest challenges in the MASH clinical research space?
So Vera, you hit the nail on the head. The biggest issue is the way trials are designed from a regulatory perspective is you got to biopsy the patient, and the endpoint is a biopsy endpoint to get approval. Okay. And so that raises some challenges because there is a lot of patients. You can screen a lot of patients into these studies, but the biopsies are incredibly variable. You see a very large, because at the end of the day, you're taking a small sliver from the liver and then you're having a pathologist read it to say, I am assessing them at this stage. Okay. To the extent that I take if the needle goes into one part of the liver is a very large organ, just to, I might have a very different read if I put the needle into one side versus another side. And then honestly, if I have two pathologists, I give the same slide to one pathologist, they'll say A, I'll give it to another pathologist, they'll say B. So one of the things we've learned along the way as we're thinking about development is how do you address that? How do you get multiple pathologists to read it, right? Biopsies are not user-friendly. patients don't like it. So you'll have a lot of patients who say, I really don't want to do this. Unfortunately, from a regulatory perspective, both with the FDA and in Europe, in the absence of other well-validated endpoints, the regulators are relying on biopsies. Now, there's a lot of work being done in the scientific community and with the regulators to use what I call non-invasive tests instead of biopsies. Things like I mentioned, ultrasounds, blood tests. And I think that will, if those were to happen, I think that will help a lot. The other challenge in these studies is these are long studies. So you got to keep patients in studies because patients take 4 years, 5 years to get to their outcomes. And so it becomes really important to have the way you set up your study to make sure that you have all the necessary incentives or motivations for the patients to stay in the study. It also becomes important is your drug or therapeutic intervention well tolerated? Because if it's not well tolerated, people are not going to stay in the study for that long. And so those are some of the challenges, but these are the primary ones. The other challenges are classic. Every therapeutic area, clinical trials has, their unique challenges, but these are ones which are unique to the MASH field.
Yeah, thank you so much for those insights. And I think they are very unique for MASH patients because I really don't think in many diseases that patients have to undergo a biopsy for enrollment and as an endpoint as well.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a big patient burden. But ultimately, I think patients would be prepped to understand that this is contributing to science and a lot of our knowledge to help potentially, more people in the future. So I think that could be a motivation for why a lot of people choose to participate. But anyways, I was going to ask you, in addition to the clinical research trends of like recruiting patients and keeping them throughout the trial and making sure that they're not lost to follow-up, I was going to ask you, what kinds of drugs or drug classes are in development for MASH these days? There's been a lot of talk about GLP-1 drugs, and they've gotten a lot of attention not only for, weight loss and obesity, but also for MASH. And so could you talk about the current treatment landscape for MASH?
Sure. So, as you know, there is one class of drugs, or one drug, which has been approved for MASH last year, which was in a class called thyroid hormone beta receptors. But fundamentally, I'd say where there are two complementary classes of drugs being developed. The first group is more the anti-fibrotic therapies for MASH. And arguably, those would become the cornerstone for the advanced MASH population, right? These are the patients who need reversal of fibrosis. And then the second group is what I'm going to call the more metabolic drugs, which target more the earlier population. They might impact fibrosis over time, but they are more metabolic drugs. The GLP-1 being a classic example, which fit within the metabolic class of drugs. Now, there are some classes of drugs, one being like the FGF21 class, which serve both as an anti-fibrotic, but also have metabolic benefits. I think over time, when you think about it, because this disease is an inflammatory fibrotic disease, but at its core, it's a metabolic dysregulation, you could see over time, patients are going to be on multiple therapeutics. So a little bit like a polypharmacy. Think about diabetes today, right? Most patients are on more than one class of drugs. Hypertension, many cardiovascular disease, lipid management, they are on multiple ones. You asked specifically about the GLP-1s. Look, the GLP-1 agonist, they are getting used already extensively for diabetes and obesity. They have shown a certain level of promise in MASH, more so in treating the MASH versus the fibrosis part. They do see a benefit in fibrosis, but it's not that dramatic a benefit in fibrosis. So the thinking which the experts have is, look, if a patient has MASH, I'm likely to use a GLP-1 because many of them have obesity and diabetes. But in the later stages of the disease, I'm looking for something which is more about a potent antifibrotic versus just something which works in the metabolic pathways. Because there's no direct GLP-1 receptors on the liver. So they work more on the periphery, and you probably want a direct liver-directed agent to have more profound benefits down, as the patient progresses.
I see. And so that does bring me to my next question, because I wanted to ask you, what do you think the field of MASH clinical research is going right now? So in your opinion, you would say it's going to pivot to those more targeted therapies that are their mechanism of action is to directly aim to reverse that liver fibrosis. And so what are kind of like those exciting breakthroughs that you hope to see in the next 5 years in MASH research?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things, right? So there's, as I mentioned, there's one class of drugs, FGF21 analogs, which are going specifically in that space, showing very potent antifibrotics. I think the second thing, which is the most exciting, is there has been recent data over the last year and a half, with certain drugs showing benefits in the cirrhosis population. So previously, people had believed once someone is cirrhotic, it's very difficult to reverse cirrhosis. And this was not just in MASH, this was whether it was Hep C, whether it was other therapeutic areas, right? And that, again, from a physician perspective and the clinician's perspective, is incredibly exciting. If we can impact cirrhosis, that's a huge win for patients, right? I think the third one is where people are looking at how do you combine different mechanisms of action, okay? So there's GLP-1s, there's the approved therapy, there's the FGF21s, there is another class of drugs called PPARs being developed. Could you actually have synergistic benefits? Because all of them are hitting a different pathway in the MASH, right? So that's a third one. The last one, I would say, which I think over the next 5 years, which I'd be excited, is there is no clear one genetic marker for MASH. MASH is unfortunately a pretty heterogeneous disease. Different patients have different factors. However, there have been some genes identified which predispose patients to have a greater prevalence and a greater progression. There are some early stage people who are seeing whether we could target one of these genetic ones, okay? Hit that. So those, I would say, are like the 4 or 5 key buckets of areas of which are pretty exciting. And, look, it's clinical development. We might not hit all of them, but if we hit some of them, like if we actually see drugs which reverse cirrhosis, that in itself could be transformational.
Yeah, agreed. And so now to kind of wrap up the interview, I wanted to learn more about you, Rohan, and what does like your day-to-day look like, and what are some of the biggest leadership lessons you've learned guiding 89bio through such rapid R&D progress in the MASH space? Could you share a little bit more about you and your day-to-day and the lessons you've learned along the way?
Our day-to-day, every day is a new challenge, right? And that's what makes it fun. But I would take it at the core. So when we set up 89bio, our singular focus was we had a mission, which was we want to change the lives of patients with severe liver and cardiometabolic disease. That honestly has not changed. And we have been singularly focused on keeping patients at our forefront, not losing sight of our mission. And that's what it is about on a day-to-day basis. Look, it's about making sure we get our clinical trials executed, making sure that, so we've got 2 large studies going on. We have another indication where we've got a third large phase 3. it's about setting ourselves for success, that hopefully if those trials pan out. So what does that mean? Making sure we can manufacture the product. It's a biologic given as an injection, making sure all the regulatory work is done, right, to get ready for that. And then importantly, from a commercial perspective, getting ready, working with patient advocacies, etc. But I would say the key leadership lessons is, one is when you're starting something which is we were a preclinical asset. For me, it was fully immersing myself into the complex scientific landscape here, remaining science driven, remaining patient centric. So I'm not a physician by training, but to me, that was one of the key things. The second was bringing on and building a team who has the same motivations and the same mission. We are very much a science driven, patient oriented company. And that was important because that's what allowed us to rapidly progress from preclinical to phase 3 in 5 years. I think the last one was, I would say, taking the appropriate risks, challenging the status quo, challenging how you're going to do drug development, challenging how you're going to, not taking risks, obviously, on a patient safety one, just to be clear. This is more about how do you push to think about different ways to do it. MASH is still a pretty evolving field, right? It's only come into clinical development prominence in the last 10 to 15 years. It's not like we have a lot of history here. And sometimes those risks have panned out and sometimes they've not, and that's okay. But then it's about being resilient and modifying it. There's decisions we've made which have not worked out. Some have worked out wonderfully and some have not. But it's being really agile and flexible. And that, I think, becomes very critical when you're working in a new therapeutic area as a startup company.
I see. And so just two more kind of short questions for you. While you were mentioning the company name, I kept on thinking to myself, like, why is the company called 89bio?
It's the short version is when the VCs were setting it up, they were trying to figure out a name for the company, and we got to a point where we had to file something. And I know this is going to sound pretty interesting, but it's actually a street address, so it's not tied with anything. And then it has actually stuck really well, and we decided to continue with that name.
So cool. And finally, could you tell us what's next on the horizon for 89bio's? So what would you like as a whole what's your vision for where the company's going in the next 5 years?
Yes. So it goes back to our mission, right? The win here is if one day we can bring this product to help patients. Otherwise, to me, that's the most important thing. So what that means is working with regulators, working with our clinical trial sites, working with the KOLs, working with patient advocacy groups to prepare for that one day. It's about executing the studies, lining up. Hopefully the studies are positive to get regulatory approval. Now, in addition to MASH, we do have an interesting program in a cardiovascular disease called severe hypertriglyceridemia. This is patients with very high levels of fat in their bloodstream, and it's a very interesting program, which we are also prosecuting on that program. And it's kind of a little bit complementary to MASH, right? Because it's a different type of metabolic dysregulation. So we're doing that in parallel. So that's kind of the beyond MASH what we're doing. But just now we are all about execution because we're passionate about trying to bring the product to help patients.
So Rohan, it sounds like you have a very motivated team behind you, and that the company's overall mission and vision is truly very patient-centric.
That is true. I'm really happy with the team we have because we're small. We're only about 100 employees, but that's what everyone is driven towards, and that's what makes it fulfilling, and we're trying to break new ground. It's a class of drugs, there's no approved in the class we are going after with our mechanism of action. So it's pretty exciting.
Great. And well, thank you so much, Rohan, for being on the show today. I really appreciate your time for this insightful discussion.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Great. And so that's the end of this week's episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. See you all next week. Bye.
To join the Xtalks community, visit xtalks.com and register for exclusive access to curated content like live webinars, news articles, and educational videos. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policy or position of Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.